problem. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone is doing well, and thank you for taking the time to join our webinar. A few items as we begin. You will be able to ask questions in the chat function throughout this session at any time. There is a question mark chat icon that you will see on your screen that you can use to input your question. We will get to as many questions as we can after the presentation. Lastly, please note that the PDF version of this presentation will be sent to you after the event. On slide 2 here is our legal disclaimer. I would ask you to please take a moment to review it relative to the presentation. Okay, a little bit about NTech Polymers. We are a leading resin distributor that is based in Orlando, Florida. Our company was founded in 1985, and we have grown our business to be a full-service distributor in North America. Relative to the automotive sector, about 30% of our business comes from the automotive sector. NTech Polymers, we believe, has the resources to support the automotive OEMs and the Tier 1 community. NTech Polymers is part of the Ravago family of companies and is the largest distribution unit under the Ravago umbrella. Ravago is a privately owned company that specializes in resin distribution, compounding and recycling, chemical distribution, and commodity trading. Ravago overall has a strong global presence in automotive, and we support a wide variety of automotive OEMs and Tier 1s across the globe. The host for today's event from NTech Polymers is myself, Eric Perel, and my colleague, Alex Lukshitis. We are industry veterans of the automotive plastics business, and we're both based in Michigan to support the industry. Our role is to work with automotive OEMs and Tier 1s for new application development and to also support our existing customers. With us today from IHS is Mike Wall, and he will be our presenter. Mike serves as the Executive Director of Automotive Analysis at IHS Markit. He brings to us 25 years of financial analysis, forecasting, consulting, and manufacturing experience, with a primary focus on assisting manufacturers and financial firms in their evaluation and understanding of the automotive industry, as well as an in-depth analysis of vehicle markets and trends. And with that, I will hand it off to Mike from IHS. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eric. And thanks everyone for joining us on this for this presentation. Just to set the stage a little bit, give anybody who doesn't know IHS Markit a little more background on our firm. We're a global automotive intelligence firm. Well, global intelligence firm. I'm in the automotive sector. We cover a wide variety of industry verticals, many of which intersect and certainly dovetail in nicely with automotive as well. But I do sit within the automotive vertical, but boy, we lean on our maritime and trade folks, and obviously with everything going on in the ports and port disruption, that's been big right now. Chemical groups. We have a technology group that's been helping us on the semiconductor front, that's for sure. Just a wide variety of different verticals that all dovetail in together into our broader firm that look to support clients with actionable intelligence to help make better decisions at the end of the day. With that, we'll get into the actual meat of the presentation. And really what I wanted to do here is kind of doing a quick around the world tour for from an automotive perspective with a little bit of a deeper dive into North America and US, touch on some other technology trends as well. But to set the stage is to really start by talking about the economic environment. How we forecast is very much a top-down and bottom-up approach. That top-down really does start with those economic drivers that can influence and impact vehicle demand, certainly even vehicle production. We look at things that can certainly influence consumer demand and the wherewithal and the engagement to buy a new vehicle. Well, one of those factors that we certainly look at is GDP growth. And you can see here global GDP growth is certainly poised to do very well this year. And that's coming off of very much a year to forget last year. It was a tough year to say the least. Certainly that's borne out here too from a GDP perspective, kind of across the board. That's really a little bit of a difference than what we saw during the Great Recession back in 08-09. It was a deeper cut last year, and virtually everybody was down to some extent, with the exception of maybe China. There was a little bit of growth in China, but even that is sort of recessionary growth in and of itself. Flash forward to this year, and we're kind of off to the races almost across the whole landscape. From a global perspective, up about 5.3%. Tell you from a U.S. perspective, we're projecting to be up well north of 6% in terms of GDP growth, and that certainly is going to be supportive to vehicle demand. We'll get to that in a little bit in terms of how that influences vehicle demand, particularly here in the U.S. But by no means can I understate the fact that between the stimulus that's going on, whether it be in the U.S. or some of the international markets, or just simply the snapback coming in from the COVID-inspired and influenced shutdowns last year, we are in a much different economic scenario right now versus where we were, again, only 6, 8, 10 months ago. So certainly much more conducive to vehicle demand and supportive of vehicle sales and production. Now, from a sales perspective, here we take a look at global light vehicle sales, and again, you can't understate just how bad it was last year. And when you look at last year, about 77 million global light vehicle sales, far cry. We vented about 13 million vehicles last year versus 2019. And 2019 was not great shakes either, in all honesty. Obviously, it was down even from 2018. So it shows just the stark fall off that we saw in terms of vehicle demand. And it is different than what we saw in 08, 09, which is kind of highlighted there earlier on as well. Back in 08, 09, it was obviously a credit-fueled downturn. The mature markets in particular took a big step back, but a lot of the emerging markets were still growing. China was growing, other markets as well. This time around, everybody went down, or virtually everybody went down in some way, shape, or form. And now we're faced with kind of digging out. And in that dig out, if you will, is going to look a little different depending on the market, depending on the region. We'll get to that in a moment. And as we get out to the intermediate to longer term, we do see global growth rates starting to level off in the low single-digit unit range as we approach sort of 100 million units of global light vehicle sales. But really, the devil's in the details in terms of the gainers and decliners and the pace of growth, if you will. And we'll touch on some of those major markets in a moment that are really going to be influencing those growth rates going forward. So from a global light vehicle production perspective, that's where we've even seen perhaps more disruption. And I'm probably preaching to the choir in some cases in this, because I know that the folks on this attending this event, certainly are at the front lines of some of this. Again, if we reference the slide prior, the global light vehicle sales market was down about 14% or so last year. You look at the global light vehicle production market, down 16%. We're down even more from a production perspective. And it makes some sense when you look at the fact that we had plants that were shut down during the heart of the COVID-inspired lockdowns, 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks of complete shutdown where we weren't producing anything. It proved to be a deep hole to dig ourselves out of. And then as we started to emerge, what did we see? We saw a lot of volatility and a lot of disruption on the supply chain front. So I'll be touching on that as well as we start thinking about the recovery. And you can see here, obviously 2021, we're looking for about 12% growth in terms of global light vehicle production. But I will tell you, it's a choppy growth pace right now. Not for the least of which inspired and influenced by semiconductor shortages. It's not just semiconductors though either. For those suppliers that are on the line who can attest, sheet steel, we're seeing sheet steel shortages and being under allocation in some certain markets such as North America. We've seen impacts to resin and foam due to some of the weather-inspired shutdowns that impacted Texas not that long ago. And of course, semiconductor plays a role as well. Challenges at ports between disruptions and really some log jams at some of these ports have really provided some very big challenges in terms of getting that supply chain really ramped up to help support production. Just a quick note on semiconductors. I know because it's all of the news, and obviously we're all feeling it. I am by no means our semiconductor expert, but I know a lot of folks that are within our firm, and I did borrow this slide from them just to put in more stark contrast of what we're dealing with here. From a semiconductor perspective, when we talk about those raw inputs being processed into wafers and then built into chips, the manufacturing cycle time is actually very, very long. We're talking months, whereas when you're talking about the actual automotive components being handled and produced over a matter of days or even hours in the case of a vehicle, your typical car can have anywhere from 1,000 to 1,400 semiconductor chips. So there is a significant reliance on semiconductors, ever more so probably than ever. When you look at the vehicle, you only have to get into your car today and see the digital clusters and the infotainment systems. There are a lot of chips in these vehicles, and it's creating this sort of disconnect, if you will, between the manufacturing and cycle time and the sourcing time on the semiconductor front to this sort of just-in-time or real-time environment that we live in the automotive sector. It's further colored and complicated by when we went through the downturn last year. As we emerged, there was a bit more conservatism on the part of the automotive industry in terms of not being sure where volumes were going to be. We're contrasted by the fact that, frankly, consumer electronics were off to the races. What were people doing when they were hunkered down? They were buying 5G smartphones. They were buying PlayStation 5s, the next gen Xbox, laptops, and the like. So there was a real competition for that capacity. And when that capacity gets allocated, it's really tough to get back if you lose that allocation. And that's what we've been trying to do, is really regain some of that automotive chip capacity. And it's been a slow process. It's been colored by other things, like a fire at the Renesas facility last month in Japan, impacting automotive semiconductors as well. So it's been this cascade of other impacts and influences as well. In this slide, all I'm trying to do here is to just show the implications of this impact. When you look at our forecast, and we update our production forecast on a monthly basis, when you look at our forecast from April, our latest forecast, versus our forecast in December, and then what we've done is we've overlaid an estimate for the semiconductor impact, and then an estimate of what is that net change from our April forecast to our December forecast, just looking at first quarter of this year. And the results are pretty stunning. What you can see here is mainland China had a pretty profound semiconductor impact, well north of 300,000 units, 365,000 units, but yet our production forecast for 1Q was actually higher. It was actually higher in April versus December. Why is that? Well, we saw outperformance in light commercial vehicle production. You could say maybe there wasn't as much reliance on semiconductors in those sectors or in those categories. We also saw that the Lunar New Year being able to afford, the way it was timed out, better production rates coming out of that as well. When you contrast that with North America, the semiconductor impact, very similar, 350,000 units or so, but yet the impact from a production perspective was even worse. Why is that? That Texas storm, that snowstorm in Texas was very much problematic from an automotive perspective. It for a multitude of reasons. It knocked out for a period of time natural gas lines, which on the one hand disrupted actual production at assembly plants. On another hand, impacted propylene and polypropylene, which were feedstocks going into foam that go into seat foam, amongst other things, and even going into resins for plastic parts. So there were additional disruptions. And again, we've seen port congestion and other disruptions on that front. Mix in a ship blocking the Suez Canal for good measure, and it adds to more of that uncertainty, particularly in markets like Europe as well. So you can see where the impacts to vehicle production are just so unique and diverse this time around as we emerge from the disruption of last year, versus, again, thinking back to the 08-09 recession. That was more of a concern of, well, when will demand come back? How long will it take for consumers to return to market? We haven't even asked that question here. Why? Because consumers are back. They came back by July, August. It was stunning to see, especially just how significant the economic environment was and how challenging it still was, that consumers were still are very much engaged. And that's sort of the glass half full side of this equation. Yes, we're under significant challenges from a manufacturing perspective that we're working to surmount. The good news in all this is consumers are still engaged and they are still buying vehicles. It varies depending on the market, but from a US perspective, it is very much off to the races. Still that way somewhat as well in China as well. So these are definitely supportive for vehicle demand in the near to intermediate term on that front. Let's talk about some of the international markets before we dig into North America. We'll start with China. Again, I've kind of segmented this into three major markets: China, Europe, and then of course North America, US. Starting with China, again, last year we were down about 4.4%, not as bad as initially feared, first and foremost. Other noteworthy item here is it was really coming off of two other prior years that were really largely to be forgotten. They were contraction years in and of themselves. So not great shakes in and of themselves in 2018 and 2019 either. So this is a market that's poised for some recovery if we get some balancing out. Obviously, from a COVID perspective, we saw China was really kind of the first in, first out of this, and they've done a good job containing outbreaks, containing any growth in case counts, and we are starting to see that demand coming back. We've got the market up 5.5% this year, and we do have it starting to approach 30 million units. It's going to be a little further out from this intermediate time horizon of 2024. So as you go out a little further, we'll eventually eclipse 30 million. But in the meantime, this is a market that is starting to be fueled and refueled, if you will, by the retail consumer. We're still mindful of the fact that we got the semiconductor situation out there. And still, we're not completely out of this COVID situation, but by and large, we are seeing that market start moving on its recovery path. Let's talk about Europe for a moment. Europe is a different animal altogether, especially when you talk about West Europe. A couple key takeaways here. When you hear about the industry and the auto industry, there's a lot of talk around, and you hear this about just the general macroeconomic environment too. But you hear talk about, is this a V-shaped recovery? Is it a U-shaped recovery? K-shaped? There's all sorts of letters we can throw to it. And in China, and indeed, you can kind of see more of a V-shape, even in the U.S. and in North America. In Europe, though, it is a little more like a kind of a U-shaped, maybe a Nike swoosh shaped, if you will. We're not getting back to those 2019 volumes anytime soon. And you can kind of see that manifested here. We're looking at production for Europe, excluding those CIS countries. And it's going to take some time yet. Now, in all honesty, if you look at our pre-COVID forecast, frankly, the Western European demand profile was not all that great either. Already, we saw that Western European demand fairly stagnant on a declining path because of demographics and pricing pressures due to CO2 emission requirements and the like. But Eastern and Central Europe, eventually in the intermediate to longer term, we're going to help to pick up some of that sluggish demand on their own right and really start to carry the day. Well, here we staged some of that out, and that's where, again, more akin to that U-shaped recovery. That's what distinguishes Europe a little bit from the US and certainly from China as well. The other thing we've got complicating matters are the lockdowns. We've seen these succession of kind of follow-up lockdowns and recurring lockdowns that have certainly been challenging. Semiconductor situation is certainly problematic as well. We've seen some stimulus certainly taking hold, but some of those stimulus programs are going to start to wind down, and they do tend to be more oriented towards low emission vehicles, electrified vehicles, which makes sense. That's where the movement is right now in terms of the push towards more battery electric vehicles in the market. So that is having some effect and influence, but the overall growth in demand is staged out further out beyond this year and even into next year. Now let's pivot and let's talk about the U.S. market in North America. So U.S. light vehicle sales, where did we go? Where were we at, and where are we going? And you look at last year, let me first color it by saying 2019, we ended the year in 2019 at about 17 million units, 17.1 million units to be exact in terms of U.S. light vehicle sales. Now, entering last year in a more pre-COVID vein, we were thinking 16.8 million or so. Then COVID hit, and we saw lockdowns, deep lockdowns, really starting in mid-March or so of last year. And just the sheer economic devastation really forced us to recalibrate. And we were expecting, frankly, a much more starker fall off in vehicle sales. Some of our planning numbers are around 12.7 million units at that point for last year. Well, where did we end up? We ended up at about 14.6 million. Why is that? Boy, it's the retail customer. That retail consumer came back strong. Daily rental fleets dried up to a significant extent once travel stopped really occurring in mass. And daily rental fleets are a significant component of vehicle sales. It amounts to about 2 million units in 2019 as an example. And last year was probably around 1.1 million. So it was a big fall off on daily rental, but the retail buyer really did help carry the day. Again, we ended at 14.6. It doesn't sound great compared to 17.1, but certainly much better than what I think was initially feared and expected. Now, flash forward to 2021, we're sitting at 16.5 million units. Again, pretty darn close to a V-shaped recovery. We were previously in the low 16 million unit range. We've since bumped it up somewhat, and there's frankly some more, I would say, some more upside potential. We've got stimulus programs that are still, that are only just starting to scratch the surface. We've got tax season really kind of ramping up as well. All of these can certainly be an impetus towards supporting vehicle sales as well, if we can get the product produced. That's one caveat out there as well. The used car market is also on fire. So that's certainly helping support vehicle demand as well. But we see these support mechanisms really helping to provide at least a little bit more stimulus in the near to intermediate term. Again, helping to support that opportunity to rebuild. When we're able to rebuild those volumes, there will be a source for those products. There will be demand sources. The challenge is getting there from here. At least in the extreme near term. There's a lot more downtime, a lot more pressure on that front, on the plant side, and there's more volatility, at least in the extreme near term, to that end. And that dovetails in nicely into this next slide. North American light vehicle production. Obviously, for those suppliers on the line, you're building parts for vehicles that are produced. Demand obviously informs that quite well, but we want to know about production, and production that's been a moving bogey. And again, the good news is demand is there to support it. The bad news is we can't get the parts. That's the challenge right now. And here we take a look at our April forecast versus our December forecast again, just to give everybody kind of a pace of the forecast, if you will. Think of December as sort of a pre-semiconductor challenge forecast versus the April reality that we live in now. And you can see that divergence. The dark blue is April, and you can see we've brought down our first half forecast significantly, down about 970,000 units. And again, we're living it right now. We're seeing downtime left and right, but it's all over the map, obviously. And that's the challenge when you're talking about something like a semiconductor chip, if you will. It's ubiquitous. It's a commodity more than anything. Even though they're highly technological, they're very much a high-tech component, but it's out there everywhere. So really, you're hard pressed to find those that aren't impacted in some way. Some are not impacted as others, to be sure, and some have done a better job managing this or have been able to manage it maybe a little more effectively, but everybody's been touched in some way, shape, or form, and we have lowered that first half forecast. Now, the question is when do we start to see some balancing out, if you will, some improvement? And that's really when we look at the back half of the year. Now, when I say improvement, too, I have to be careful. I don't want to paint too rosy a picture. When I say improvement, we should see more stable supplies of semiconductors. The big question is, when can we get extra to maybe help recoup some of that lost volume? Well, the reality is when you sprinkle in that fire, that Renesas fire in Japan, that pushed us back a little bit, in addition to, again, just some sluggishness in getting that capacity assigned, that we're probably looking at towards the tail end of this year, and realistically more of a 2022 story to really recoup some extra production. And you'll see that in a moment as well. Net, though, we did boost second half relative to our prior forecast, up almost 500,000 units. But again, it's still a measured kind of growth relative to our prior forecast. We're still seeing it's more or less just trying to execute with the capacity we have, and that includes semiconductor capacity that we're able to get. Keep a real close eye, watchful eye in July and August. Those summer shutdowns are kind of in everybody's, certainly in everybody's foreground right now, in terms of there are automakers that are looking to shrink those summer shutdowns to try to get some extra production going. That's only going to be as effective as they can get parts, obviously. That's the biggest challenge in the near term. But there is that opportunity. We could see some outperformance. And again, you see that here when you look at our latest April forecast. We are expecting July and August to outperform somewhat versus our prior December forecast as a comparison on that front. Now, when we look at North American production annually, again, that V-shaped dynamic kicks in here. I can't emphasize that enough. Now, it's not perfect V, I admit, because we're at 15.7 million units for 2021. Were it not for the component pressures, though, we would be at 2019 volumes and likely beyond. We'd probably be closer to 16.5 or better million units for 2021. This is more component inspired and component pressures as opposed to demand. Demand, especially on the retail side, has largely come back. Daily rental is not back. I'm not trying to paint too rosy a picture. It's going to take some time. Business travel coming back before we start to see daily rental demand really coming back with a vengeance and a gusto. but retail sales and retail demand is darn near pre-COVID levels right now. And right now, what we're doing is we're just trying to get as much component activity and component sourcing and availability as possible, and in order to help support inventory rebuilding as well. We're sitting, I think, right around 2.4 million vehicles on dealer lots right now. It sounds like a lot, and it is, but realistically, we should probably be around 3 million or 3.2 million, or even better, to be honest. Now, we could see automakers and dealers realigning to a new inventory environment, and that's a possibility. But at the end of the day, the key takeaway on this is we don't have an inventory issue by any stretch, and that in and of itself is also supportive of vehicle demand or vehicle production growth. Longer term, you can see us, we're in the 16.7, 16.8 until we get out to the very tail end of the forecast horizon, and that goes back to that broader question: how do we get to 17 million? And I do think there is the opportunity to get there, and there's some upside potential. It deals with these battery electric vehicle launches, some additional localization, obviously USMCA really kicking in as well, more regionalization in terms of supply chains and even production bases as well, I think is certainly supportive to the outlook for North American light vehicle production. Now, when we look at the production outlook by country, again, that kind of sort of supports that fact as well and sort of doubles down on it. Here we look at it by country in North America, so US, Canada, Mexico. And I do make the comparison 2019 to 2028. I kind of removed 2020 out of the mix because I don't want to skew the numbers, and that's sort of the year to be forgotten. So we look at pre-crash, so 2019 to 2028, a couple of really key takeaways. One, light vehicle production growth in the US has got a lot of room to run yet. We're baking at about 1 million units of growth between now and 2028. We've got a new plant for Toyota and Mazda in Alabama. You've got some new capacity coming online for Stellantis, new capacity and expanded capacity for other automakers as well. Certainly, most definitely supportive for the production profile in the US. Mexico, growth of about 60,000 units. I know that doesn't look necessarily like a lot, but it's we're going to be approaching 4 million units in Mexico, and there's still the potential for some upside there, based on the free trade agreements that Mexico has, the installed capacity base, and the potential to grow capacity further. You look at Canada, and it looks kind of bad when you see a contraction of 460,000 units, but I put a little asterisk there, though, in its own right, in the sense that Canada, over the last year or so, through the Canadian Auto Workers Union and some agreements with both, Ford and GM in particular, are really doubling down on battery electric. So there is that potential. There's a wild card there, maybe for some outperformance, depending on that adoption curve on battery electric, as Canada kind of makes a push to be something of a center of excellence on that front in their own right. So there's some opportunity there more than anything. So we'll keep a close eye on that as well. Now, here we look at it by automaker type. And one key takeaway I like to jump out right away with is just referencing 2019. When we look at it, Detroit 3 versus the transplants versus kind of those new startups in light blue. But when you look at 2019, it was the first year we got to parity between the Detroit 3 and the transplants. Again, in history, this was largely a D3 majority game from a production perspective, and that is changing. It's changing, and it's not meant to be a criticism of the D3, frankly, either. What you're seeing is a core production base for the Detroit 3, whether it be trucks and SUVs, or even some of the battery electric launches as well, and then more localization on the part of the transplants. And that's where we're seeing some of that extra growth coming out in the intermediate term as well, as we start eclipsing 8 million units of production, some more sourcing going on here for the transplants in North America. And then, of course, we have to be mindful of the startups. Now, of course, right now, that light blue is largely Tesla. It's a Tesla-only game. But boy, that is starting to change, and really that's manifested here in this next slide. Here we take a look at all these various new startups. I get asked this a lot, do we have all the startups in our forecast? Short answer is no, because there are a lot of startups out there, but we have increased rather significantly the number of startups that we have included in our forecast. Part of that I would attribute to the advent of the SPAC, and being able to kind of take your automaker to market at a much more rapid clip and get that funding source really locked in. And I think that's added some, call it credibility, but added some wherewithal, for lack of a better term. You can see some of the bigger players obviously highlighted here. Rivian jumps right off at you. an interesting business case there in that they're going for the heart of the retail buyer in sport utility vehicle and pickup. You'd be hard pressed to pick a couple of segments that weren't more important. And then the commercial market with Amazon in sort of that delivery and last mile delivery. I mean, it's the best of both worlds. So really an interesting business case there. They got that Mitsubishi Normal, Illinois facility. I think a really attractive deal on that. So that gets them a production footprint. So again, we're looking for some, I would argue, some pretty decent volumes coming out of Rivian. You've got Lucid Motors in there in that sort of darker blue. More of a traditional go-to-market strategy, a la early Tesla in terms of traditional sedan type of premium sedan, luxury sedan launch, and it has a different maybe growth profile, at least initially, but then coming out with expanded product plans after that. So we're watching those as well. And then it's kind of a melange of just a bunch of different other strategies. We've got some bus and van market strategies with micro factories and with Arrival. We've got subscription-based strategies with a pretty diverse lineup with Canoo, of course, Lodestone Motors with their pickup and van strategy, focusing more on the commercial market, and even Zoox looking at some of the autonomous technologies and really creating a full ecosystem. So they are varied. That's my biggest point on that is, so if to the extent that you're getting RFQ opportunities, again, use this as maybe something of a guidepost, but when you're thinking about the volume opportunities, at least in the intermediate term on that front. The next slide here, one of the things I like to review with folks is the launch activity. You know, so much oxygen is depleted on volumes. You know, whether how many vehicles did we sell last year, what are we producing, and what have you. But what doesn't get talked probably enough about is the launch activity and vehicle delays and pull aheads and just the number of vehicle launches that are occurring. So here we take a look at North American light vehicle production launches. These would be all new vehicle launches or majors, anything that kicks off a new program code. And for a lot of folks on the phone would likely kick off an RFQ for you. And what we saw last year is a drawdown, to be sure, in the number of vehicle launches. It makes sense when you take a plant down for 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks, you're going to see some delays in vehicle production. That's natural. That's the near-term stuff. The other thing that we saw that's also natural when you see a big macroeconomic event is you start to see some delays in vehicle programs in the sense of you've got automakers maybe looking to recoup those program costs for maybe a longer period of time because they got to recoup some additional volume, if you will. Again, burn those costs off and amortize them a little bit longer. Certainly natural to see, and we have seen some of that. To the point, 2023 and 2024 are going to be that next stage of that super cycle really starting to kick in. 37 launches, 35 launches, and pretty diverse when you look at the types of vehicles. Obviously, much more utility biased, but cars and pickups are certainly going to be launched as well. And what's also built into these numbers, frankly, is all the battery electric vehicle activity that we're seeing coming down the pike. Roughly 55 all new nameplates in between now and the end of our forecast horizon. And that doesn't even cover the full landscape. There's about another well in excess of 100 more battery electrics that are going to be imported or that are part of broader multi-energy nameplates where you've got maybe an internal combustion option and a battery electric option as well. So the product cadence and product launch activity is going to be robust, and it's going to be really taking off in the next few years here. Again, for some of those long lead suppliers on the line, you're already getting those RFQs. You're already dealing with them right now. If you're a little bit closer to the start of production in terms of your sourcing window, that is going to be heating up for you, and it's going to be heating up here pretty quick if it hasn't already. Now, a couple slides on powertrain, because I don't want to give this whole shift towards electrification short coverage. I want to make sure we kind of cover it adequately. Here we take a look at North American production, just to at least frame it appropriately. And again, the opportunity and maybe a little bit of the risk conversation around this. Again, when we look at the battery electric vehicle production coming down the pike, the bar chart here looks at just model count. How many models are being produced in that given year? And you can see the run-up is going to be ramping up here very quickly. We've got about 18 models identified this year. By 2025, that will go up to 72 models, culminating to 87 models by 2028. The model count is spiraling. Now, growth in volume, battery electric volume is growing as well. So absolutely, and that goes hand in hand. What I'd like to focus particularly suppliers on is the slide on the chart on the right-hand side. This is volume per nameplate. And again, this is generally where suppliers get paid, if you will. This is where, as especially high volume suppliers, so many suppliers are used to building for hundreds of thousands of parts, for hundreds of thousands of vehicles. Your average internal combustion vehicle program could be anywhere from 85,000 to 90,000 units per nameplate. And then, of course, that belies the fact that you could have a Silverado out there, or a F-150 or what have you, which is certainly many times or certainly well in excess of that. As we grow this model count in battery electric, you can see that average volume per nameplate really going down significantly to the tune of probably being in 20 to 25,000 units per nameplate for at least a period of time. So I only bring that up to say, be mindful of the fact, maybe be protective of adding some flexibility into your lines, the flexibility even in your quoting process, as you're thinking about volumes that you're baking into your activity-based costing, as an example, your bill of materials, because a couple things are going to be coming to fruition: the potential for a bit more volatility in volumes, and the potential for it to maybe needing a little bit longer runway to take off. I mean, this is all part of the conversation, because we're adding so much competition, but yet we're in a market that is still in the nascent stages, at least from a battery electric perspective. That could change and will change as the government, as an example, brings in some additional stimulus, which we'll touch on in a moment. But by and large, when we think about it, especially in this intermediate term, just be cognizant of the fact that throughput, that volume per nameplate, could come under rather significant pressure as more models are launched. That dovetails in nicely here. I like to give a little contrast, compare and contrast North America, and this is all production basically by propulsion type. So for North America, Europe, and Greater China, and we look at it 2020, 2025, and 2030. Europe and Greater China are in a different world apart than where North America is right now. Why is that? We're seeing significant impetus and push on the part of the governments, whether it be Europe with CO2 emission requirements, really pushing along that electrification curve, that adoption curve, if you will, in Greater China through stimulus and subsidies and other exemptions to try to stimulate electrification as well. And we're seeing that borne out, frankly, with the data even currently, what we saw last year as an example, going into this year, and those take rates. But going into our forecast, you go out to 2025, we're about 19% full battery electric for both Europe and Greater China, and then 38% for Europe by 2030, and probably 30%, maybe when there's some upside in Greater China. Now, we look over to North America, and it is less. Now, you look at North America for 2025, we're at 9%, and then by 2030, we're at 18%. And again, this is based on vehicle production in North America. Now, the big caveat in this, though, is we have not seen the federal government, fully weigh in on this yet. We've seen obviously there's a different strategy being employed, and we saw with CAFE, with the Obama administration did ramp up those fuel economy requirements. The Trump administration came out with what was called the SAFE rule, really kind of lowered some of those outward requirements. Now the Biden administration has been telegraphing, I think, rather vociferously that changes are coming. Now we don't have a full comprehension yet of what is going to be approved, what will happen, but some of the things that we're hearing about. Beefing up the charging infrastructure. I think that's critical. We definitely need that within the broader North American market, U.S. market. Possibly looking at those purchase incentives, making them available at time of vehicle purchase, and then also removing the cap. So automakers like Tesla and General Motors can suddenly benefit from those $7,500 incentives again, because they haven't capped out by hitting those volume caps. And then maybe even potentially boosting those incentives as well, maybe taking them for $7,500 to $10,000. There's other things as well to try to stimulate and really help to support vehicle demand for the electrified vehicles that are out there that can lead to some further upside, particularly as you get out to that 2030 timeframe. I think there certainly is that opportunity and potential. We start talking about the pricing and cost of the battery electric vehicles as well. We're seeing a lot of advancements on the battery side that is helping to draw down the the cost of the battery, getting it closer to parity with an internal combustion engine. Probably aren't quite there yet. We're expecting maybe in the next few years, 2026 or so, we get closer to parity. That would be certainly a big statement and big testament into itself as well, and helping that cost benefit analysis on the part of the consumer, helping to support that as well. And not the least of which too is just the sheer number of new models that are launching that are kind of in the heart of where consumers are. Again, crossover utility vehicles, pickup trucks, as we're hearing more of that as well. That can certainly be supportive of consumer adoption as well on that front. This is my final slide before we turn it over to some Q&A. Here we take a look at, how has mobility changed and how has COVID maybe impacted that? If we think kind of pre-COVID, we were viewing the nexus, if you will, of mobility in three spheres: automation, so think autonomous vehicles and the like; ownership, is it personally owned vehicles, is it mobility as a service, that sort of thing; and then propulsion, electrified vehicles in particular. What we've seen as we went through COVID, it was interesting. COVID has had differing impacts on these different legs of the stool, as it were. From an EV adoption perspective, we've actually seen an acceleration in some cases, especially in Europe and in Asia, Europe and China in particular. We've seen some acceleration in EV adoption, so that's had some affected some change in and of itself. From a ownership perspective, sort of that mobility as a service, it's had kind of differing impacts. If you're looking at moving people, like car sharing, well, that has not gone as well. People, in the days of COVID, people were kind of pushing back on that. They wanted their own personal vehicle for that safety and that concern, that germ-free concern, if you will. But boy, I'll tell you, when you look at mobility as a service in terms of delivering goods, it was off the charts. Uber Eats, DoorDash, Postmates, all performed very, very well. That last mile delivery, if we think about, the Amazonification of society, very well in and of itself. I put in here vehicle miles traveled, VMT implications across the ownership spectrum. I included that because what we saw last year, obviously when everybody hunkered down and kind of went working from remote, we did not drive as much. So vehicle miles traveled has some impact and influence on this as well. If we're not putting as many miles on our vehicles, that might impact sort of that return to market. We have to put a little bit of a placeholder on that to see if that's got some legs to it or not. But it's something that we're keeping an eye on as well. And then the autonomous side, we've seen some I dare say some recalibration on this front. It's on there as a red light, and it's not so much meant to be a red light for the technology itself, but maybe in terms of the deployment. The classic fully autonomous L4, L5 type of vehicle seems to be staging out a little bit farther, 2035 maybe and beyond. That's not to say there aren't autonomous vehicles out there being tested or out there in the wild. They are, but in terms of mainstream adoption. But what we have seen, which would be more of a green light, frankly, is the just explosion of what's called maybe L2 or L2 plus and L3 autonomous technology. Call it that driver assist, semi-autonomous. Think of something like the Super Cruise with General Motors, where you've got some truly assisted driving technology that's being deployed, and frankly, that's being well received and starting to broach into the areas of being in demand by consumers. So the push towards that technology has, on the one hand, very much a tactical feel in that we're getting that benefit very near term, kind of very impactful to now. And we are seeing some maybe redeployment to those efforts as we still kind of sort out the L4, L5 technology. And when I say sort out, it's not even about sorting out the technology, it's about sorting out the legislation, the regulatory side, insurance, and all of those other factors, liability, that we still are having to navigate in some ways. And again, those technologies are still being deployed and they're still being tested and executed. But by the same token, in terms of mass adoption and mass deployment, we see that occurring further out, whereas more of the semi-autonomous technology is happening here and now, and it's actually happening even as we speak. With that, I will turn it back over to Eric and we'll be happy to take any questions you might have.
Okay, Mike, good job. Thank you very much. And A lot of things changing in the industry. We actually did get a couple questions. I'm going to paraphrase here a bit for a few of them. With the recent announcements by most automotive OEMs relative to plant shutdowns, can you please comment on what production will look like this summer? We are seeing a lot of announcements in the market that OEMs are going to try and run hard through the traditional summer shutdown. Are you seeing the same, and do you feel that they'll be able to achieve what they want to achieve in terms of production?
I am. We are absolutely seeing the same, and you know, I want to say with every fiber of my body that we're gonna barrel roll through the summer months and outperform. My pause is that's only going to be as effective as we can get the parts, and so that gives us maybe a little pause. And again, I mentioned earlier we have boosted our July and August forecast. For those specific months. And believe me, there's every incentive for the automakers to do that, to try to outperform and to shrink those downtimes. And I do think you're going to see that. We're kind of in this sort of trust but verify zone right now because we're a little nervous is we still need to see those extra semiconductors being available. You know, things like I'm getting the sense in general, polymer or the resin side and the foam side seems to be a little less of an issue. We've heard rubber as one example kicking in now too about there being some tightness in the rubber area. So we have to keep an eye on that. But in terms of the categories, the component categories, it does still largely seem to be revolving around semiconductors. So the asterisk I have to that is to the extent we can protect and secure those semiconductor shipments, absolutely. The automakers are ready to go. And again, they're ready to go. And it's not even just to really backfill inventory at this point. It's about keeping the consumer at bay and satisfied because, like I said, the consumer is ready, willing, and able to buy. So in some cases, they're buying it right off the truck. Or no lie, I mean, I've been covering this industry for 25 years. I don't know that I've ever seen it quite like this. We've got consumers that are going into dealerships and buying that shipment that isn't even gotten there yet. So, they're betting on the shipment to come. So yes, the short answer to your question is yes, we do expect that. We're just tempering it somewhat by the fact that the supply chain issue is still a little murky.
Okay, we're seeing the same thing. Thank you. Mike, we got a lot of questions about electrification, and I guess I just will paraphrase here a bit because it's more of a question about what your opinion is, because obviously there's a lot of talk about potential full electrification as early as 2035. Given some of the news around Lordstown, which we've got obviously a couple questions about Lordstown that came in as well, and the challenges that they're having with their vehicle, do you feel that the industry will be ready to come out with a saleable vehicle that meets the consumer's demands, that they'll want to buy in quantity at the right price? And then lastly, do you see gas engines fully disappearing in the future?
Boy, that's a loaded question if I ever heard one.
I know it is.
One that I get all the time. So that's the fairest of them all. So, and I want to be as forthright in answering this as possible, but it's a complex one. So if I started by saying, what do these EVs have to do? We have to, as an industry, or if we want to sell EVs, we have to remove as many of the objections from a customer base as possible. And I'm mindful of the fact we sold last year about 2% of our U.S. light vehicle sales were full EV. So we got a long way to go. Now, one could argue that in some cases, it's largely Tesla was just about the only game in town, with the exception of Chevy, not to take away from the Chevy Bolt and other newer players that have come to the market. But we have to augur into exactly some of those factors you were talking about: pricing, the cost of the vehicle, range anxiety, and charging infrastructure, capabilities of the vehicle. I do think that's an area where we have come a long way, and we will come even farther in terms of the capabilities of these vehicles. And that's where you see some of the players like Lordstown and others, where from a commercial perspective, you can lean into sort of that hub and spoke approach from a charging infrastructure. If I go to a home base, charge up, and then I go off and I'm doing last mile delivery or what have you, there's a perfect business case for that. And I think there's absolutely opportunity on that front. On the retail side, what we see with some of these electric vehicles, whether they be the sedans and utilities that are out there, or even the the trucks, the pickup trucks that are coming, they're very well done and well executed, and they give you great instantaneous torque and other factors. But again, we've got to solve the riddle of charging infrastructure, how long it takes to charge, and again, the overall cost of the application. Do I think we'll get there? I do think we're going to get there. I do. And do I think it's going to be closer to, in the U.S., closer to 2025 or 2030? Probably in between there, if I were going to kind of ask for a little wiggle room. But the key crux of that is there's going to be a lot of product being deployed between now and then, to be sure. Do I think internal combustion is going away anytime soon? I don't really. I mean, I still see there as being a pretty robust internal combustion, at least through 2030. And I say that, I'm mindful of the fact that we got a lot of states out there that are coming out and saying, no more after 2030. And 2030 seems to be one of the bellwether dates, or 2035 at times. And I don't know if we'll get to that point at a federal level, but that would be something to at least keep our eye on, because when you start getting those mandates, that's going to, I think, tell more of the story than anything.
I agree. It's all moving fast. And Mike, just a couple more questions here. One of them has to do around the take rate of light trucks and SUVs, which I believe is around 70% or higher.
Yeah.
A question came in: do you see these vehicles continuing to gain market share versus passenger cars? Any predictions how high this number will go in 2021 and beyond? Yeah. And especially with obviously all of these vehicles being ran by gasoline engines, and the change to electrification will have an effect on that. America likes big vehicles, right? So
yeah, absolutely, and it's a great question, because what we've seen is the consumer is driving this ship, and they really are driving the bus, as it were. The demand for utility vehicles and pickups is off the charts, and you're right. I want to say we were probably about 76% last year. We see that right now. The growth rate is starting to slow somewhat. So we are starting to see the semblance of a floor shaping up for sedans, and call it sedans, coupes, convertibles, if you will, passenger vehicles. But by the same token, we see it getting up close to 80% still for utilities and pickups, pickups, and minivans. So think of it as more like an 80-20 type of environment. So there's still some room to run yet.
Wow, excellent. Thank you. And then just one last question actually has to do with our particular business relative to plastics. And it's two questions, but I'll just kind of roll them into one. Resin shortages have plagued our industry now since the famous winter storm that came out in February. And do you expect buyers to purchase more stock and source materials locally and sooner? And then with that, with these increases that we're seeing in challenges within the supply chain, not just in plastic, but you mentioned foams and metals and others, what are you seeing, in the industry about potential suppliers going out of business, like we saw maybe in 2008 or 9, which was a different situation back then, but we'd like to get your opinion.
Yeah, I'll attack that one first, because that one's been definitely top of mind, and I've been struck by, even if you think back to 0809. One key thing to think about there is I would submit that in 0809, we didn't lose nearly as many suppliers as we feared. I think going into that, if you were to tell me we had both General Motors and Chrysler filing bankruptcy and going under, and then a succession of other, frankly, large suppliers that did, I would have thought we would have lost a lot more, especially some of the smaller mid-sized folks. We didn't. They hunkered down, to their credit, and survived. Now you flash forward, and now we went into this COVID situation. Suppliers were in a much more, I think, more well-funded position. I'm speaking in generality, so there are definitely always exceptions to this rule, but certainly a more profitable position to be able to weather the storm. And so I think we have seen that a remarkable ability for those suppliers to be able to hunker down and kind of, and frankly, we had the PPP program kick in, and then we just some of that is a snapback as well. We've seen that snapback. So where I've seen suppliers, frankly, go down last year, as an example, I won't name names, but it seemed to be more, there were other intervening factors kind of at play. And again, I'm speaking more in generality. So I don't underestimate the ability of a supplier to kind of hang in there, and realistically, we probably could still use some consolidation. And I say that humbly, but I'm afraid we do. And so we're still going to have, and we're not as bad as Europe, and we're not as bad as Asia in terms of fragmentation, but we still have some opportunity to do that. Now, resin specifically, or buying strategies. I'm telling you, what we've seen with the semiconductor situation, I am starting to lean towards this concept that I'm not saying just-in-time is going away. It's not. Just-in-time manufacturing is the way of the world. But I think it's going to be just-in-time with a caveat of also covering our tail a bit. And by that, I mean, so coming out of this, we talk about it from a resin perspective or a semiconductor perspective. I think there is going to be maybe creating some additional buffer stocks. Now, the devil's in the details there. Who's paying for that carry cost? And that is, likely to be determined or to be negotiated. But I do think you're going to see some of that in the extreme near term in particular, because everybody's going to be protecting for volume to be able to build and overbuild to be able to recoup that lost production. And then there's something else that was kind of embedded within that question too, is where do we see that going forward? I do think we're going to see maybe a little bit more of a regionalized, not supply base, because we already have a regionalized supply base, but regionalized sourcing strategies to leverage those supply bases because of the benefit of having the here and now in the locality and not having to worry about having it on a boat, being stuck out, on maneuvers off the port, waiting for it to come in. And that doesn't mean you wouldn't be vulnerable to a snowstorm or what have you. There's always those vulnerabilities, but having that supply chain a little bit closer to base, the home base, if you will. In the case of North America, it's colored by the fact that you do have Mexico as something of a low-cost country, and the U.S. with USMCA and Canada certainly as well. I do think there's going to be some of that opportunity in the more really near term, but certainly intermediate, longer term as well.
Okay, thank you. Good answer. And then just a couple more. This one focuses around autonomous. Once autonomous vehicles lower the rate of crashes in total vehicles when that's in the future, do you expect vehicles to have a longer life cycle and sales volumes due to decrease because of a vehicle basically lasts longer? So in other words, that's a great question. If the vehicle drives itself and there's less crashes because you take away that issue, do you expect the vehicle will?
There is that potential. No, absolutely. There's less scrappage, if you will. There's scrappage as it relates to accidents, and then I'll throw another one in there. As we have more electrification, vehicles don't have the same type of repair profile. Doesn't mean they last forever, but they could maybe last longer than average. Now we're averaging right now, average vehicle age is right around 12 years. So it's been growing somewhat. Do I think there's going to be the potential to grow that further? I do. I think there is some of that opportunity, especially when you see full autonomous en masse. Now, again, that's much further down the line in terms of the full autonomous, but yeah, definitely I could see that, because you're going to be getting rid of a core component of that scrappage that is, vehicles being totaled.
Exactly. Okay. And then last question, and this obviously relates to our business from a plastics perspective. Internal combustion to electric transition, how do you feel it will impact polymer demand over time? And that's obviously a great question, because a lot of plastic is currently used under the hood in powertrain applications for gas engines. Yeah,
it is a great question. And I do think, it's a tough one to answer but I can say, I think it's going to shift. And where I've seen suppliers, and I'll speak more at a higher level, but then we can try to dig into it a bit, where we've seen the door close in certain areas because they've been so aligned to internal combustion. I think of maybe a stamper that's making clamps for exhaust clamps. You look at them and you're going, man, you're in trouble. What are you going to do when there's no engine? Well, guess what they're doing now? They're quoting on business for partitions for battery trays and separators and things like that. I think there will be some other opportunities for polymer within that battery landscape, battery pack. Another great example is engine cooling. You would think, well, engine cooling, as engines go away, you aren't going to need to cool those engines anymore. What are those engine cooling suppliers going to do? Well, you know what they're doing? They're moving into battery cooling and battery thermal, battery heating. So there are some of these other sectors of the vehicle that I think are, now where I am probably a little bit more ignorant is I'm not exactly sure to what extent polymer augurs into that, but I have to think there are going to be some opportunities in those areas. Are they equivalent to under hood right now? Maybe not. I mean, that's a challenge, but it's early days too. I do think there are going to be some opportunities though.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mike. You did a fantastic job. A lot to ponder, a lot of changes within the industry, and we appreciate you taking the time to work to present here to the group. I also want to thank everybody on the call as well for your time. I know it's valuable these days, and we appreciate your ongoing support. Hope everybody has a great day. Thank you.